How's it going, everyone? Welcome back to Boylei Hobby Time. We're back in the wild imaginary west this week with a recreation of another Yellowstone hot spring. I started the build by giving these plastic figures a bath in dish soap and hot water. I've been told that gets rid of mold release and helps the paint stick better, but honestly, the plastic still struggled. Once these squeaky clean minis were dry, I snipped them from their runners. I chose a couple figures from a Pegasus box and the others were from a box of IMAX. I used a little bit of a flame treatment on the bottom of each figure to help them stick better to their painting base, and once those were glued, I set them aside to work on the hot pool. Last September, my wife and I went on an awesome road trip around the Rockies, driving from Denver to Yellowstone and then all the way down to Albuquerque, and I took some pictures along the way, including one of Morning Glory Pool, which I've recreated before. On that trip, we also saw our very first wild grizzly bear for the first time. But all that being said, I'm going to be recreating another beautiful hot spring from Yellowstone today, this time Emerald Spring, which was one of my favorites. For the base, I'm going to be starting with a sheet of MDF, followed by the 7 levels of Dante's Foam Inferno, which I pre-cut off camera. I started tracing out the shape of the pool onto the top layer of foam. This one has a bit of an undercut, so I wanted to have it cut before gluing it to the other layers. I then glued the lower 6 levels together, and finally glued the last piece to the MDF itself, all using some foam-safe superglue. The next step was to begin carving the shape of the spring. After the first layer had been carved, I traced the outline of that shape onto the layer beneath it, and then began carving the monolith of foam that was the lower 6 levels. I did want this to look as much like Emerald Spring as possible, so I had my phone open with a reference photo the whole time. At this point, the foam was far too smooth to be a convincing hydrothermal pool, so I began carving some Organicness into it with a rotary tool, if Organicness is a word. I had my mask on the whole time, but only thought to use a vacuum for the second half. After the cavity had been drilled, I scorched the foam with a torch to increase the organic look, and finally the third horseman of the organic apocalypse was a wire brush, which took the edge off the foam surface, and I was happy with where it was at. The next step was to cover up all the organic texture that I had worked so hard to create with Sculptamold. No, just kidding. The point of the Sculptamold is now that I've removed enough volume from the foam, I can go back in and refine it, as well as give the foam a nice hard surface that will be more resilient than just the pink foam by itself. All of my nice texture will still be there. I also coated the exterior of the foam with some Mod Podge to help slow down the resin should there be any leaks. After setting aside the hot spring to dry, I wiped down my hobby mat before painting my little western gentleman, who I primed off camera. And while I paint these minis, I'd like to give a little bit more wild imaginary western lore, as well as give a huge shout out to all of my patrons. In case you didn't see my last hot spring cross-section video, or forgot about it, there was a creature hiding at the bottom, only its glowing eyes were visible. I already know that many of you are thinking, no animal could survive the near boiling and highly acidic waters of the Yellowstone hot pools. Exactly. That's why this monster is so scary. It doesn't really care what we think about its ability to survive in the near boiling and highly acidic waters of Yellowstone. After the first round of Sculptamold had dried, I added a second round, building up the rocks around the rim that I saw in my reference photo. And while that was drying, I added some bones and dead tree branches to the pool, and it was time to add the monster. Or at least part of the monster. The scaly, scary creature hiding at the bottom of this hot spring is the same one from the first hot spring diorama that I made a couple years ago. It's a very mysterious creature. In fact, no one has ever survived to describe it fully. But what we do know about it is that it has highly reflective eyes and 5 digits on its hands. Once all of the debris and the monster hand were in place, I waited for the second round of Sculptamold to dry, and then I painted the pool. The reason this monster is so mysterious is that it stays in the hot springs almost all the time except to come up for air or travel between hot pools under the cover of night. It eats the bones of creatures that have fallen into the pools or drags creatures into the pools that have wandered too close. It survives primarily off of the calcium from the bones that it eats, but it will never miss an opportunity for a nice protein-rich snack. After giving the pool a touch of color, I added some earth effects to the surface of the ground around the pool. I didn't need to do too much in terms of color and saturation because the resin will be tinted and pulling most of the weight in that regard. For the thin, concentrated ring of minerals built up around the pool, I used some white water highlight paint from Woodland Scenics. This stuff had the perfect off-white color that I was looking for. After some final touch-ups, I gave everything a coat of matte varnish to keep the acrylic paint from seeping into the resin. I made sure that everything was sufficiently dry before installing an acrylic dam, which will hold back the resin as it cures and should snap off easily later. I used a silicone adhesive to hold the acrylic in place, which creates a nice seal, and I smoothed that out with a palette knife so that it didn't smush into where the resin will be. I pressed the acrylic sheet firmly into position, and I sealed the top edge, because resin has a way of sneaking out, and then I waited 24 hours for the adhesive to fully set. I knew I was going to be adding resin in different layers, and I wanted to minimize the possibility of visible layer lines, so I tipped back the diorama and used some clamps for the first pour. The idea was to just give the very bottom layer a slightly greener tint than the rest, simulating the actual appearance of the emerald pool, with none of this layer touching the acrylic. I dosed out the first batch, I combined it with some pigment, I got rid of all of the nanobubbles in my vacuum chamber, and then it was time to pour the first layer. I also grabbed a brush, and I used this batch of resin to coat the inside of the pool to help prevent any leaks in later layers. Once the first round was done, I took off the clamps and I reoriented the diorama for the second pour. My thought was to pour the second round at a 45-degree angle with the top line being right at the surface of the pool, but I realized too much could go wrong if I tried to do it like that, so I switched back to level to take my chances with some visible layer lines. To help prevent any coloration changes between the following layers, I mixed up a batch of hardener and I tinted that. That way I could add resin to the correct ratio and have the same color every time. That was a tip I got from someone in the comments. I can't remember who it was and I couldn't find the comment, but if it was you, thank you very much. I repeated the process of mixing, vacuuming, pouring, and popping bubbles for the next few days until the pool was finally filled. I then left it for 3 days to cure fully. During the last cure, the resin had shrunk a little bit, causing the surface of the pool to sink a little bit, so I mixed up one final batch of resin. Poured it over the surface, I popped all the bubbles, and I left it for a final 72 hours, and it was finally done. And I could finally remove the acrylic. And that is my most successful deep resin pour to date. To get a nice clean surface on the front of the rest of the diorama, I traced out the shape of the pool onto the acrylic that I had just removed. I cut it on my bandsaw and I used it as a stencil to transfer the shape onto some wooden veneer. This is the cheapest wooden veneer that I could find locally, so you don't have to feel bad when I paint over it with Black 4.0. After the veneer had been installed, I trimmed and sanded the edges, and then I broke out said Black 4.0 and I painted the faces, which I carefully cut in with a tiny brush before painting the rest. I don't know if you can see this on camera, but at one point during the final cure of that last layer, I set the diorama on another surface that wasn't quite level, causing this ripply effect, which is exactly what you'd see on the surface of a hot pool. It was a happy accident that created a far better surface than I could have manually, so I'm pretty happy about that. To wrap up this project, I added my prospectors, who are unfortunately also in the market for animal bones, which can be found in hot springs. After the men were in place, I assembled a single pine tree from a woodland tree armature and some clumps from Diorama Presepe. After that had been glued in place, I called it good. That is it for this video. Thank you all so much for watching. Hope you enjoyed. Huge shout out, as always, to my patrons. You guys are the best. Have an awesome week, everyone. I'll see you next time.